I'm really excited to have this guest today on Bad Faith Podcast. Shir Hever is the coordinator of the military embargo campaign of the BDS movement, something we've talked a lot about over the years, in particular after October 7th, but haven't had a chance to really drill in more deeply on. So welcome, Shir. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So it's described as the military embargo campaign of the BDS movement, what strikes me right up top is that oftentimes in the contemporary conversation, we're talking about what seem to be sort of ad hoc movements of people who read a story about Starbucks passing out drinks to IDF soldiers, or people in Indonesia who associate chicken, what do you call it, KFC, with the United States of America, and who are boycotting Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in heavily Muslim countries like Indonesia. And previously, before October 7th, we were talking about BDS largely in the context of various American laws that attempted to make illegal or criminalize, or at least create consequences for individuals who subscribed to BDS. We had Abby Martin on talking about how she encountered one of these laws when she tried to get, I believe, a grant to speak at a university down in the South. But you're talking about it from a much more strategic and comprehensive and less ad hoc perspective. So from your perspective, talk to us about what the BDS movement is and how it is designed to work.
The BDS movement was launched in 2005 by Palestinian civil society organizations exactly with this aim in mind, to have a strategic, sustained pressure campaign to promote the application of international law, human rights, equal rights, and there are three very clear demands. It's not just to express our outrage, but really we're trying to change reality by putting this pressure. So the idea is to have a whole series of campaigns of many different kinds. You've mentioned some of the recent ones, but the campaigns have started already in 2005. And there are academic boycotts, there are cultural boycotts, there are consumer boycotts, all which are organized by grassroots groups and civil society organizations and activists in different circles. You know, there are student groups, there are unions, there are churches, and they create a very, have very clear demands, very clear tactics in order to achieve those demands. Through boycott, divestment, sanctions. These are the three words that make up the BDS acronym. And one of those campaigns is the military embargo campaign. That's where that's my little corner within this movement, where I'm coordinating it. Of course, I'm not leading it, but it's people on the ground who want to make sure that their countries or their state or their university or whatever is not involved in arming Israel and its genocide against Palestinians, and trying to stop the weapons, to divest from the arms companies so as to not profit from genocide, not to profit from apartheid. So that's the military embargo campaign, which has made some very dramatic successes in the last couple of months. But I think the only success that we will really feel is a success when we stop the killing.
What have the dramatic successes in the past month been, and who's been kind of responsible for them?
So there are already states which have decided that they will respect and enforce the military embargo. So of course, first, states from the global south, they're the first to rise up against apartheid and racism and imperialism. But so Colombia, Brazil, in some extent, Chile. South Africa, of course, but also we have activists in Malaysia who are trying to stop the ships carrying weapons to Israel. We have activists also in the Mediterranean who are doing this. And we have states now also in the global north who started to, first because of public pressure, saying, okay, we will refrain from selling weapons to Israel. This is what we heard from Italy, from Canada. But we also have Spain, which legislated a law to enforce the military embargo. And we also have Ireland, where it's a little bit more of a complicated story because they already have the legislation in place, but the US is exploiting a loophole and sending their cargo planes full of weapons to Israel and landing illegally in Ireland, always saying, well, it's an emergency landing. It's this plane is full of bombs and we don't want it to crash. So please let us make an exception and land in your airport. So now there are Irish legislators who say, okay, well, if it's an emergency and we have to let this plane land, we're just going to confiscate the weapons. So they will stop using this loophole. So these are already successes that we're starting to see in different countries. In Japan, there are two giant corporations. Itochu is one of the biggest companies in the world, really. It's the size of a small country, which decided to stop all the cooperation with Israeli arms companies to develop drones and things like this because they don't want to be complicit in those crimes.
It's interesting because I guess my perception has been that the overwhelming bulk of Israeli armaments do come from the United States of America. So I'm curious about what sort of impact the participation in all of the nations you just listed in an arms embargo is having on Israel's ability to pursue its siege on Gaza.
Yeah. I've intentionally kept the U.S. activism out of my list just so because I imagine this is something we're going to talk more about. So keeping it for the meat of our conversation. But of course, the vast majority of the weapons are coming from the United States, but they have to pass through other countries in order to reach Israel. And also, we have a category called dual-use items. Dual-use items are not defined themselves as weapons, but they can be made into weapons, like explosives. Explosives could also be used for civilian purposes. And India, for example, is selling a lot of those explosives to Israel. But in order for those explosives to come from India to Israel, they have to go on a ship around the entire continent of Africa, because right now they cannot pass through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So they're making the long voyage. And this gives us the opportunity to activate or to engage with ports all along the way of activists who demand that the ship be searched. So if there's evidence, there's documentation that a ship is carrying weapons or components for weapons from India or from any other country to Israel, then it has to be searched. So the U.S. is, of course, using naval ships to bring their weapons. This makes it more difficult for us to search and detain those ships. But we do have port workers in Cyprus, in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, who are very concerned about this and say, well, we're going to do whatever we can to prevent those ships from passing and bring in weapons, because we know these weapons end up killing civilians, killing children.
And when you say we have port workers, I mean, how coordinated is this and how much relationship do you have with these individuals? Because it does seem like on an individual basis, they're exposing themselves to a great deal of vulnerability and are showing a great deal of courage and being willing to basically not do their jobs, thwart the operation of their businesses in order to stop the weapons from getting to Israel. I mean, how alone are they? How much support do they have? How much protection do they have and organizational support? And are people kind of suffering consequences for this sort of civil disobedience all around the world? What's happening to people?
Yeah, so when I say we, I mean, it's a movement. And my role is to coordinate and to be in contact with these people. And some of them are actually asking to be anonymous informants and not to come forward for obvious reasons. And they want to protect themselves for the reasons that you just mentioned, of course. But there is a very clear difference between states which are in the global north, like in Europe, and the states in the global south, where, of course, in many countries that are not democracies, that don't have a lot of freedom of expression and freedom of labor, the right to strike and so on, these port workers are not really able to take action without repercussion, which we in the BDS movement will never ask them to make. We'd never ask people to sacrifice their own freedom and their livelihood and their families for the cause. Everyone needs to know what exactly they are willing to do for Palestine, for justice in Palestine, and know it in advance so they don't end up regretting their commitment to help. But in Europe, it's a different story because in Europe, you have these unions, which are pretty strong, and they have some more democratically established rights. And they're saying something very interesting. They're saying, according to European law, it is illegal to transit weapons to states committing serious war crimes and genocide. Even the suspicion of genocide, when it's not yet fully discussed by the International Court of Justice, it's still, the court has called it probable or plausible genocide. So, but that is enough to meet a requirement which is called the third state obligations, where they have to legally stop the weapons. And these people would say, we're not going to go to prison to keep our jobs. And if the company is telling us you have to do something illegal, it's the company that's taking a risk, not us. So what we often have is these people from the global south who are not able to go forward, but they can give us tips, they can give us information. And they're telling us, look at this particular ship. We believe this ship is carrying weapons to Israel. And then we go to the ports in the global north and we ask them to search the ship.
Okay, that's really useful. But that does now make me think, cut to the United States of America, where ostensibly we also have laws in the books that are supposed to prohibit us from selling arms to countries that are in violation of our own humanitarian standards and the legal law, for example, but also international law. So, and that hasn't put a dent in America's willingness to provide arms to Israel. Of course, in the last couple of days, there's been this big brouhaha where Netanyahu put out this English language message, basically wagging his finger at Joe Biden for the one little tiny hiccup of a suggested pause in arms sale weeks ago, and criticizing him basically for holding up arms to Israel when the opposite has, of course, been true.
I said it's inconceivable that in the past few months, the administration has been withholding weapons and ammunition to Israel. Israel, America's closest ally, fighting for its life, fighting against Iran and our other common enemies.
Blinken admits the U.S. briefly held up one shipment of weapons, but says others are in process, and said the U.S. is committed to Israel's security.
We have a commitment to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against a whole variety of threats. Gaza is part of it, but it far surpasses Gaza in terms of the threats they face.
Behind the scenes, the White House reportedly is furious over Netanyahu's comments. Axios reports it canceled a high-level meeting with Israeli officials over long-term Iran policy.
It seems to have caused the greatest amount of consternation from the White House that we've seen so far. It wasn't tens of thousands of dead civilians. It was this kind of pushback from Netanyahu that seems to have rankled Biden. But all that being said, what's going on in the American front with respect to the BDS movement?
Yeah, well, I suspect that you probably know more than I do about U.S. politics and about the feeling on the ground. But what I see very clearly from the U.S. is a very, very prominent activism by Jewish groups. Jewish Voice for Peace has become the leading organization for BDS and for the military embargo. And as a Jew myself, I can really understand where this is coming from. I can see why these people go to the forefront of the sit-ins and just wait until they get arrested. And so you get those numbers that hundreds of Jewish activists get arrested. And you think, is the police intentionally arresting only the Jews? But no, that's not the reason. The reason is that they're sitting in the front line because they need to be able to look at themselves in the mirror later, or to look in their children's eyes to say where they were. So this is something that, for me at least, is very moving. And I don't know exactly what Biden is thinking to himself and how he thought that this would end up in a way that would be beneficial to him politically, to support unconditionally an act of genocide. And there already have been legal action taken in the United States. A court, the Center for Constitutional Rights, filed a lawsuit against Biden for genocide. And the court said, actually, we think this lawsuit is justified. And it's our opinion that this is indeed the case. We just don't have the jurisdiction. So the Center for Constitutional Rights has no choice but to go up to upper echelons of the legal system. But how can this, what possible gain does Biden get from this? I'm not qualified to answer this. But I do think that for Israelis, that's something I'm a bit more qualified to talk about. For Israelis, when they see what's happening in the US and they see this kerfuffle between Netanyahu and Biden over this tiny shipment of weapons, and Netanyahu saying he's going to go and speak in Congress again like he did 2016 and to spite Obama, that they are saying, well, this is really the end. That Netanyahu is just, making it easier maybe for Trump to win the elections, but this would be the end of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And they're saying there's a lot of similarity between what happened in Afghanistan and what might happen in Israel. One of Israel's biggest billionaires just said it yesterday. Gil Shveid is his name. He said, who wants to invest in Afghanistan? And the U.S. spent so much money and so many weapons and spilled so much blood to keep the Karzai regime in Afghanistan as a sort of proxy of U.S. imperialism in the region, until Biden said, okay, I've had enough. And then the next day, they're all gone. Taliban took over, and the Israeli soldiers know if the U.S. stops the weapon shipments, they're just out of ammo.
Is there really legitimate concern? I mean, obviously, I kind of want that to be true. I want there to feel like there is some pressure on both Israel and Biden to stop this war. But I got to tell you, from an American perspective, the fact that Biden seems to have committed, to have taken this posture for the last 8 months and show no sign of wavering. There are kind of rhetorical gestures at wavering, right? But we've seen such a consistent pattern of it just being rhetoric without any real consequences, without really using the lever of withholding aid shipments. In fact, that the rhetorical gestures seem very meaningless from the American perspective. So he can say there's a red line. He can say he's very upset with Netanyahu. He can say he had a terse conversation. He can say all these things, but it seems meaningless. So from my perspective, at the very least, it feels like Israel should be sitting very comfortable and very confident in its enduring forever support from the U.S. government, because you have a president in the middle of a campaign that he's likely to lose precisely because of that commitment, and he's still unwavering in that commitment. And similarly to your point about the perception, the kind of the influence, the impact that seeing so many Jewish advocates for ceasefire getting arrested here and advocates for BDS getting arrested here in the United States of America. I mean, it's inspiring. I am so invested in their courage, and I'm so grateful to them. It's also the case that our own American media routinely refers to them as fake Jews, routinely says that they don't, anti-Semitism against those protesters is not really anti-Semitism because they're not really authentically Jewish. You have Jewish professors being denied tenure and having their jobs threatened with lawsuits. You have Jewish professors being knocked down by the police and dragged off limp. And the American media class is at best indifferent to it. You have an elected a Congressman, Richie Torres, just going online in the last couple of days saying that people who are in these pro-Palestine Jewish groups like JVP are basically fake Jews. And I would remind you that this is not a Jewish congressman who has the audacity to opine on other people's Jewishness, but a Gentile, Black and Latino American guy. You know what I mean? So this is, I want to believe, help me understand what the positive impact of all of this stuff is from your perspective. And you're calling in from Germany, right?
Yeah. And in Germany, the things are not any better in terms of oppression of Palestinian solidarity voices, also among Jewish groups. And I'm also a member of the Jewish Voice for Just Peace, which is sort of a sister organization to JVP. Yeah, absolutely. But I do want to ask you, for those Jews in the U.S. or elsewhere who are doing everything in their power to get a ceasefire and to stop the genocide and to end the system of oppression, you don't need to be grateful to them because they're not doing it for you; they're doing it for themselves. Or we are doing it for ourselves.
But I'll say this: I'm familiar with this dynamic as a Black leftist who, in the context of American politics, was maligned very similarly. There are echoes, and I feel a lot of like empathy is maybe the better word, because my political position, not being the majority view, and certainly not the majority view overall, or the majority view for Black Americans, I was similarly described as not really Black or white adjacent or somehow racially inauthentic because I was progressive. And so I understand the role that I played in the progressive movement as someone who can give a face to the idea that there is a diversity of opinion within this movement. And so I see the value of that, and I really appreciate it, and I see the value of it with respect to the Jewish protesters as well. That's all I mean to say. Yeah. But yeah, tell me,
Yeah, and I've been called a fake Jew as well, and there is a certain amount of absurdity also to turn the identity of a group that has suffered racism and discrimination. I don't need to tell you anything about this. Into a kind of privilege, you don't deserve to be called that. When in fact, for my grandparents, it would have been wonderful if they could have passed as non-Jews when they had to escape from Europe. But this is, but I want to get back to your question about seeing the bigger picture here, because of course, like you say, Biden is unwavering, but there is a difference between the kind of military financing that the US gave to Israel for 75 years, especially the 50 years after the war of 1973, and almost 51 years on the one hand, and the military financing that we're seeing now, which is actually not financing anymore. That's the difference. So the current minister of finance in Israel, his name is Bezalel Smotrich, and he's one of the most rabid, racist settlers. He called himself a fascist and a homophobe. He is hated by his own staff in the Ministry of Finance in Israel. So his staff wrote a document, which I have. It's in Hebrew, and I couldn't believe when I read it, because they knew the minister is never going to read his ministry's own report. So they wrote whatever they thought about the minister just out there and put it online. And they made a list of the gaps between what is the government budget, which was budgeted according to the budget books, and what was actually spent on and what. And usually this is a one-page document. The Ministry of Finance is always obligated to publish this, or a couple of pages. This time they published a 400-page book where they basically go through the arms deals and say, look, this is a weapon shipment that was imported from the United States, and we paid for it so and so. It wasn't for free. That's the difference. And also the big package that Biden worked on so hard for the $108 billion. From that, 14 billion was for Israel. And these 14 billion is not really for Israel. It's export permits for weapons that Israel has to pay for. And Israel is running out of money. So I can see how the arms industry in the United States, the military industrial complex, which has such a strong lobby in the United States, much, much bigger and much stronger than the Israeli lobby. IPAC is tiny compared to the lobbies of Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and L3 Harris, these giants. But these lobby groups, of course, they want Israel to keep buying all these weapons because it's so expensive and they get so many billions out of it. But once Israel is no longer able to pay, then is the question, who's going to pay for it? I think that if Trump is president, he's not going to pay for it.
Really? Because, this is an interesting point of contention that's happening sort of internally. There are obviously a lot of people who are completely disgusted with Biden and his willingness to support this war, this genocide. They do not see Trump as a better alternative, but sort of the the current status quo seems to be so bottom of the barrel that people feel like, hey, there's nowhere to go but up. Trump is trying to appeal to this sort of America First base that, generally speaking, is opposed to American spending on foreign wars. So he does a lot of rhetoric that suggests that, I'm going to wrap this war up quickly. I'm going to improve on Biden. I'm just going to wrap it up quickly without really saying what that means or how. But some people take from that, okay, he wouldn't continue to support financially Israel indefinitely in this matter. But at the same time, he seems to talk out the other side of his mouth. He is claiming to be against the war in Ukraine at the same time that it was he that sat down and basically blessed Mike Johnson, Republican Speaker of the House, who came down to Mar-a-Lago to get his blessing to push through this funding bill for Ukraine. So it's like a black box. It's like an unknown with respect to Donald Trump. But why are you so confident that he is not going to continue to fund Israel?
I need to be very careful when talking about Trump or about U.S. politics in general, because of course I cannot tell you or your listeners and
but
viewers
it's interesting.
what to do. But I do want to say, but specifically about Trump, I do have two things that he already did when he was president, and they are for me very telling in how his policy looks like. I don't know if this is going to be his policy if he's elected again, but this is what he did already. One thing was that Obama, when he was just on his way out, the end of his term, he signed a memorandum of understanding with Israel to change the military financing. And this was reported a lot as if Obama increased military financing to Israel to the tune of $3.8 billion a year. But actually, he decreased it. That's a very important point, because what he did is increase it nominally, but stopped the fixing to inflation. So for a period of 10 years, in the long run, it means less money. It also means that some of the privileges that Israeli arms companies had, that they could take some of that financing to themselves. No other country in the world has this privilege, would be phased out. So this is something.
What does that mean to take some of the financing for themselves?
Because this $3.8 billion is not for Israel. This $3.8 billion, the Israeli economy doesn't see a single cent from this. This is only for the U.S. arms companies that are paid by the U.S. taxpayer so they can send free weapons to Israel.
I see.
But Israel was the only country in the world that receives this kind of military financing, which had a special privilege that 20% of that amount they could pay to Israeli arms companies, which with subsidiaries in the U.S., and they would send the weapons to Israel, but the money also goes to Israel, actually. So Obama phased that out. And then when Trump became president, he was asked, are you going to reverse this memorandum of understanding? Because you're reversing everything that Obama did. And he said, no, I'm happy with this one. So that's one thing. And the second thing is when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which was, of course, an aggressive act of flagration of international law. And on the day that the embassy was moved, Israeli soldiers killed 56 Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and on the fence as they were doing unarmed protest there. But Trump only decided to move the embassy when Sheldon Adelson told him he's going to pay for it. So the building and all of the costs involving the moving of the embassy were covered by a private billionaire and not by the U.S. Government. And so these two things are telling me Trump is very happy to support Israel out of racist reasons. And he has this famous quote where he said, we need to learn from Israel what to do in the inner cities. Meaning racial profiling and police brutality. That's what we can learn from Israel. So he sees a lot of similarities between the kind of regime that Israel has and the kind of regime he would like to have in the United States. But is he willing to actually spend any resources on that? This, I'm not so sure.
So this is interesting. Okay, so you've painted a picture now of American presidents who we sort of perceive as being very faithful to supporting Israel economically. actually demonstrating a little bit of restraint with the 10-year Obama aid package not being adjusted for inflation, with Trump being willing to, be rhetorically supportive, but not actually extending any of, America's own money toward these ends. All right, I take your point. And I especially am interested in this point you made about it having a real world material impact in Israel, which you say is running out of money at the same time that its finance minister, Smotrich, is apparently facing a kind of revolt from inside the house. So what does that look like? What kinds of real financial pressures is Israel facing right now? Is it the case that it might have to politically take a step back from the siege on Gaza because it simply cannot fund it anymore?
I think we're already at that stage in many ways. Israel's credit rating has collapsed. Its state-issued bonds are rated as worse than Mexico's, which, that in itself doesn't mean that the economy has collapsed, because there are countries poorer than Mexico which are still stable. And that's not the point. The point is that when you have a state that is considered one of the more stable economies, that has this prestige as a startup nation, and within a matter of months finds itself in this state of collapse, then investors are running away. The Israeli public itself is actually running faster than the investors. In terms of the local trust funds and the local pension funds and so on. They've already shifted the bulk of their investments abroad because they don't believe in their own economy. So why would international investors believe in the Israeli economy? And they're not. So they're pulling out their money. So we're seeing a collapse of international investment. The Israeli currency is actually backed by the Central Bank of Israel, which is selling the dollar reserves every day to stabilize the Israeli currency, the shekel. And every day they see how much the shekel is collapsing, and they're selling some US dollars, buying shekels to stabilize the price. But once they run out of reserves, then the currency will be worth less than the paper it's written on. And this is something that a lot of Israelis already are thinking about and trying to protect themselves from this. You have, and you specifically mentioned how this affects the genocide, the invasion of Gaza, the killing. There was a video by a reservist soldier who put it online. It became viral. He covered his face and he said, "We've been here for 8 months, and we know that our jobs back in Israel are gone. Our families in Israel probably don't recognize us anymore, and we've lost our social circles anyway. So we have nowhere to go back to. We're going to stay here and kill as many people as we can. And even if the government tells us to withdraw, we won't. We will disobey the order." And this video became viral among Israelis because it actually shows to you that what's happening in this genocide is not that the government is financing a strategy, a military strategy, in order to achieve some kind of goal, but rather that there is now the military is just acting out of control, and the government, for populist reasons, is not stopping them and not doing anything about it, and just trying to supply them with enough ammunition so that they can keep going, because once it doesn't go anymore, then there is no future for this. All these reservists they don't have a job anymore, and they don't have a life anymore.
Let me understand. I guess I'm struggling with the kind of connection between what you're describing as kind of an economic downturn in Israel, absence of jobs for returning soldiers, a lack of confidence in investing in the country, and the war on Gaza. I mean, it does seem like for a country that is considered to be so stable, to have such a decline in a relatively short period of time is somewhat anomalous, especially when at least the perception from this side of the Atlantic is that it's such a, it's not a perception, it's the reality. It's such a disproportionate conflict. It does seem, it's not as though there's really a discussion of Israel as a country being threatened in any way. It's a siege on Gaza and in Gaza as opposed to one that's being fought in Israel. There was reporting, and I'm happy to have you weigh in on this as well, about concerns that there was this report that on what Hamas was planning to do that was retained by Israeli intelligence prior to October 7th. And the choice not to do more to fortify Israel has led some to make accusations that Netanyahu wanted a crisis like what happened on October 7th to fortify himself politically and to be able to litigate a war in this way. I know that's controversial. People can feel how they want to feel about it. But that I only bring that up to say, is this really an issue of Israel being vulnerable genuinely, or is it a kind of constructed vulnerability? I mean, all that being said, I'm struggling with the cause and effect of Israelis' economic downturn, which I take as a kind of success for the BDS movement and success for people who want the genocide to end, and what's been happening on the ground in Gaza, or the kind of international consequences from the BDS movement and other protest movements around the world.
So, I mean, let me try to connect these two things together, because this idea that the Israelis or the Israeli intelligence knew about the imminent attack and how it's going to look like and decided not to do anything about it, this is a conspiracy theory. But behind this conspiracy theory is a colonial way of thinking, which says, well, of course, the Israelis, being Western, being mostly white, are more intelligent and than the Palestinians, who are savages and primitive. And so there's no way that the Palestinians could outwit and outsmart the Israelis. And if you start from this racist assumption, then of course it's easy to believe that there was some kind of ulterior plan and the Israelis knew everything and decided to let it happen. What is actually what we're actually seeing is something else. We see that Palestinians are human beings and they're just as smart and just as resourceful as Israelis. And they have been living under a system of oppression, of apartheid, of ethnic cleansing for 75 years. And the idea that Israelis had that this is sustainable, that Palestinians will just agree to live another 75 years under these conditions, this is what is surprising. This is this colonial arrogance which needs to be studied more. And you said it's not usual for stable countries to collapse, but that actually it is very usual. This is how it usually happens. I'm talking to you from Germany, where East Germany was supposed to be a very strong and stable state until it collapsed in a matter of days, because people really didn't believe in a future for it. And that's the main point. When people don't think of their political project as something with a future, then the political reality can change very fast. And the same can be said about South Africa. South Africa, I think, is the best example for what's happening in Palestine, because it is an apartheid situation in Palestine today. It was an apartheid situation in South Africa. And the white population in South Africa had more weapons, more money, more technologies of oppression, international complicity. And yet there came a moment in which they said, well, we can't do this anymore. And we just have to have an election where everybody has the right to vote. And within a day, not only did the whole political system change, but also people's mentality changed. People changed their perspective on reality. And this is a very well-known fact that the white population in South Africa supported apartheid. More than 90% of them supported apartheid until the very last minute. And when apartheid collapsed, they said, we were always against it. And I think this is exactly what we're going to hear from Israelis as well, where now the vast majority of Israelis are supporting the government, supporting the genocide. There's been a recent poll which was only conducted among Jews, not among Palestinians. And the Jews said, 4% said Israel has gone too far in Gaza. 4%. Which means 96% don't think Israel has gone too far. This is, it's hard to believe, but I do think that once the political situation changes, you won't be able to find those 96% anymore. They will disappear, and they will say we were always against it. And so it is a capitalist system. Capitalist economies, even more so than East Germany, which was not a capitalist system, are based on the perspective for the future. You cannot invest if you don't think that your investment is going to carry some profit in the future. And if people say, well, there is no future, and it's only the time perspective is just a matter of weeks, Netanyahu just wants to avoid elections for one more week at a time. The soldiers are just looking to fill their ammunition stocks for one more day at a time. Then there is no thought about the future. So you also mentioned the military side of things, and I think we need to see the difference between the genocide, where civilians are being killed, children are being killed, and they really cannot defend themselves. They have no weapons. And of course, the fact that Israel is killing so many people is not a sign of its strength. In Rwanda, a genocide was committed with machetes. That's not a sign of the strength of the Israeli military that they can kill children. But at the same time, there's also a war being fought. A war that the Israeli army is fighting against Hezbollah in the north and against Hamas in Gaza. And in that, when we're talking about this military confrontation, where they're actually fighting against people who can defend themselves and can fight back and have weapons, they're not making any strategic successes. They don't have a plan. And they're even losing territory, which is in Israel's history unprecedented.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess what I was thinking of is when you said there are soldiers who feel like the jobs that they left 8 months ago aren't still there. I guess my just very practical question is, what were they doing and where did those jobs go? Especially in a country with mandatory conscription, mandatory service, it feels notable that people would feel that degree of insecurity in such a short period of time when there's, this kind of national commitment to service, and that I would expect people to have their sort of employment protected in the way that you would protect, a pregnant woman going on maternity leave, at least in a normal country, not like ours where we don't protect pregnant women at all. But that's just, a frolicking detour. But yeah, that's what struck me. Like, how could things have changed so quickly that a soldier wouldn't think they had a place to return to just 8 months into fighting?
So the mandatory conscription in Israel is a sham. This was the case in the generation of my parents, but because it's a colonial society and not the militarism has a limit, because it's also about prestige. It's also that if soldiers don't want to, or young Israelis don't want to go to the army, then forcing them to do so goes against the whole idea of a superior class of people or of Jewish supremacy in the region. So I didn't go to the military. I avoided military service. It was very easy for me to avoid military service. I didn't have to pay a heavy price for it because from my generation, it's almost 50%. And then the conscription rate went under 50% very shortly afterwards, because anyone who goes to the military and says, I don't really want to be a soldier, they find a way out. So the ones who go to the army are the ones who want to go. So that's one thing.
How do you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but how do you get out of it?
So
what are the off-ramps?
Yeah, for me, I pretended to be crazy. And that's what a lot of people do. Yeah.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. It's and there is a military psychiatrist who has to decide if I'm really crazy or just pretending. And the psychiatrist knows that maybe I'm pretending, but if he forces me to go to the military anyway, and I commit suicide or something, then they will go to him and ask, why did you recruit this person? But if he lets me go, nobody will ask any questions. So the easy thing to do is just to let everybody go. So this was, and he only asked me one trick question to see if I'm really pretending or not, and asked me, what do your friends think about your ideas that you're telling me about? Those ideas I expressed in order to sound crazy. I told him, I don't really have any friends. And he's, okay, that's the right answer. You're not going to the army. So this was
wild.
Yeah, but there are also a lot of Israelis who are from lower socioeconomic classes. They don't have a family that supports them during the military service so much. They tell the army, okay, if I'm going to the army, During vacations, I need the army to rent an apartment for me. I need the army to do my laundry on weekends, something that usually the family will do, which is not usual for armies in modern countries. And then the army would say to that soldier, we'd rather use our resources doing something else. Do you really want to be in the army? And if they say no, then they're exempt from service for social reasons. So that's also a possibility. But you mentioned this law that does exist, that protects reservists, that they cannot be fired from their jobs while they're in military service. And this law is exactly the same idea as maternity leave for women. This is exactly the same social idea. But it was, of course, a law that was written for reserve duty that was up to a month a year, not more than this. And then the state has to pay the salary of that worker and also support the workplace so that they because they lost an employee. But now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers, which are 8 months. Some of them are continuously in reserve duty. So yeah, their employers are not able to legally fire them, even after 8 months. But the company went bankrupt. And if they have their own business, then there is no protection. And the state just said, we're not going to do anything for businesses who lost their workforce. So this is something to do, I think, also with the decision of Intel, one of the world's biggest companies, to end its plans to build a factory for $25 billion in Israel. And this is maybe the biggest BDS victory of the last year because it's such a huge investment that was preempted. Intel have seen that the Israeli economy is collapsing and that their workforce in Israel is actually not showing up for work. They are in Gaza. So a big percent of them, they said more than 10% of the workforce. So why would they build a factory which has no prospect of productivity? And why would they make an investment in an economy that might collapse very soon? And why would they make themselves open for international boycott campaigns for their complicity with genocide? So you can see how this is a very fast developing snowball effect.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's really clarifying because you've dotted the I and crossed the T on my understanding of how this is actually having a real effect on the ground. I mean, I am curious then, you alluded to the statistic that says, 96% of Israelis don't think that the government has gone far enough in Gaza. I've inverted it, but 4% think that the government's gone too far, which the implication is the rest don't think so.
Yeah.
And yes, these things can change very quickly, as in the South Africa example, although I got to say, those kind of stats is why I look sideways at South Africans over 40. It's a presumption. It's a rebuttable presumption, but I'm going to start with that little bit of a sideways glance. But I am also, what does that mean? Even if people don't care about what's going on in Gaza or don't think that the government has gone too far, I would presume that they do care about the economic downturn of their country. A significant contract like the Intel contract to build a base there not going through. And what kind of pressure is that putting on Netanyahu or any other Israeli leaders to stop this conflict? Because we did see, the massive protests last weekend. It seemed like those were largely about not prioritizing hostages. How much of that is also about feeling that Netanyahu just isn't providing good economic stewardship for the country?
Well, this one point about the economic stewardship is how Netanyahu is holding on to power by his fingernails because he's doing everything in his power to create the illusion that everything is fine. And even if it means that in the long term, the economy is ruined by this. So last weekend, there was in Israel a heat wave. And a lot of people turned on their AC and used up a lot of electricity. And the electricity company saw that the whole grid is going to shut down because there's not enough electricity to power all the ACs of people. So the government took a decision. They're going to burn up their emergency reserve of diesel in order to keep people being able to turn on their ACs during the heat wave over the weekend, knowing that this diesel is supposed to be there for strategic reasons and they cannot just let it go. And also that burning up so much diesel is the disaster for the environment and causes lung disease and it pollutes the air very, very fast. But the reason that they had to do this is because Colombia decided it's going to stop selling coal to Israel. And Israel is mainly consuming coal to make electricity. The next two countries that are providing coal to Israel after Colombia are South Africa and Russia. So the Israelis don't know if they can count on their coal imports for much longer. So they were thinking that anyway, Israel wanted to upgrade its electricity production to natural gas because they have natural gas rigs in the Mediterranean Sea, including one that is siphoning the natural gas from Gaza illegally, but they're still using this natural gas. And they want to use that as a slightly cleaner alternative to coal. But in order to upgrade their power stations, they need cement and they need steel that is important from Turkey. And Turkey says, no, we're not going to give you any, we're not going to allow any exports of cement and steel to Israel until people in Gaza get food and medicine. So this is a situation that really, you can see how the Israelis are living in this bubble where they can turn on their AC and everything is fine. But outside of this bubble, the whole system is collapsing. And what's going to happen if they turn on their AC and the power goes out? And there is no more emergency diesel.
It seems like you're saying it's basically just a matter of time, and that this sort of global solidarity movement is genuinely having an effect, that they're on the precipice.
I do think so, yes. It is true that I've been accused many times by my colleagues and friends of being maybe too optimistic and too much wishful thinking. And I think it's also a matter of
I thought you didn't have any friends.
Yeah, don't tell the army. But yeah, I mean, it is a matter of timing.
It is a matter of timing. I am curious, generally speaking, you alluded to some of the, frankly, I would describe it as authoritarian pushback that pro-Palestinian voices have received in Germany, just like the United States and across the world. What your experience has been like as someone who's so vocal and so deeply involved in the BDS movement, living in Germany?
Yeah. I don't feel very comfortable answering this question because nothing that I've been through or my friends have been through, including my partner who was arrested for having a sign that said another Jew for a free Palestine.
Wow.
None of that compares to the least of what Palestinians have to go through, whether it's in the West Bank or and certainly in Gaza. So it is true that there is a lot of oppression in Germany, but it's still, they're not killing us. So it's a bit, yeah. So it feels a little bit tasteless to mention this. BDS was just listed by the Germany. Well, it's like the FBI, more or less, their equivalent organization to the FBI, as a suspicious organization for its extremism. So they're thinking about because, but all of this oppression is really pointless because they cannot silence people. They cannot change public opinion. If anything, they're doing the opposite. We've seen this in the recent elections for the European Parliament, that the political parties that support Israel unconditionally and support the shipping of weapons to Israel have lost tremendous amounts of votes. And the parties that are standing up against it have gained a lot of votes. So even though there's an overall shift to the right wing in Europe, but on this issue of Palestine, all of this oppression hasn't been successful at all. And I think that's why they're escalating the oppression, because they know that public opinion has shifted in a different direction. They know that the facts speak for themselves. There's now a lawsuit in the ICJ against Germany by Nicaragua for its complicity with genocide. And maybe this lawsuit by the ICJ doesn't have the best chances of success, also because of the power differences between Germany and Nicaragua. But I've listened to what the German lawyers were saying at the court and how they defended themselves by contradicting themselves and saying, we're actually not selling that many weapons to Israel. And we believe that Israel is following international law, even though we cannot show any evidence for this. It was pathetic, really. So what can they do? They just cancel events, they cancel lectures, they try to break up encampments at the universities, as of course they do in the US all the time. Maybe another difference between Germany and the US is that Germany is maybe the country which finances culture with state resources more than any other country in the world. It doesn't leave culture to the free market at all. But the financing comes with strings attached. So you have so many authors and theater groups and art painters and musicians who are being told, if you do anything for Palestine, you're going to lose your funding, which of course also increases the outrage.
Germany is hardly unique, obviously, among countries that have been repressive toward pro-Palestine advocates. We've all seen the Suella Braverman dunks and then the interview after interview, and people getting arrested for flying Palestinian flags in England and France and etc. But it does seem particularly ironic, dark, that Germany seems to have learned all the wrong lessons from its history. I don't know. I wonder, do you feel like I've seen the argument made that Germany is kind of overreacting, like it's defensively out of guilt, being overly defensive of Israel because of its own legacy of the Holocaust, and that is why they're acting out in the way that they are. Do you feel that? I mean, how is this all being discussed among kind of regular people? And do you think there's any kind of truth to that insight?
I think a lot of Germans would like to think that their politics towards Israel is a reflection of their taking responsibility for the Holocaust and the crimes that Germany committed. But one of the reasons that Germany is facing such a crisis right now is that this turns out to be a big lie. Because Jews were not the only victims of the Holocaust. There were also the Sinti and Roma who were victims of genocide as well. And they don't have a state. And they don't buy German submarines. And they don't get reparations. And they don't get a special Memorial Day in Germany. So this is, it really shows the difference that there are cynical reasons that Germany is supporting Israel. And now it comes to light. Now it becomes very clear because Germany considers itself the world leader on opposing genocide. They're saying that we know what genocide is because of our history, so we will prevent it from happening in other places in the world. So they played a major role in the court deliberations, in the legal cases against Serbia over Srebrenica and Myanmar against the Rohingya. And now, when South Africa filed a lawsuit against Israel over genocide in Gaza, Germany said, we're going to stand on the side of Israel. We're going to say that this is not a genocide, even though the number of people who were killed is more than double of Myanmar. And even though the proportion of the population that were killed is equivalent to Rwanda, and even though the intention to commit genocide, which is the key point from the legal point of view, it's the intention, is so clear.
Yeah. Before we wrap, I did want to ask you, I brought this up in the very beginning, and if you don't have a lot of thoughts on it, no worries. I know that this isn't your realm per se, but I have been curious about these sort of organic boycotts that seem to have sprung up. Some of them were sort of contentious early on. I think there was a restaurant owned by a Jewish owner who also was Zionist in Philadelphia early on in the conflict that got boycotted, and there was a whole debate over whether or not his support, I think he had maybe given money to a fund to help Israeli victims of October 7th or something like that. It wasn't like an institutional support of Israel, and there was a lot of debate about whether or not choosing to boycott a restaurant like that was anti-Semitic or fine. There have been instances where people say, well, we should be boycotting McDonald's because they handed out I think they handed out meals to soldiers. You know, does a local McDonald's making that kind of decision warrant a global boycott? Also, like, maybe we don't care because McDonald's is trash anyway. The association, I think it's in Indonesia, but it might be Malaysia. It's a heavily Muslim Southeast Asian country. Sorry if I'm forgetting the particulars. They're like, none of them are going to KFC not because I don't think KFC's done anything in particular, but because they're just associated with an American company. My personal feeling is like, great, like, power to everybody. If people want to not go to KFC and KFC feels like it is like forced to like donate to Palestine to try to get people off their backs or something, that seems like a net benefit. I can also see an argument that some of the kind of messaging messiness across some of these instances could have negative backlash for the BDS movement. So I wonder what your thoughts were on all of this.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to this because it's a very important point. And I'm not going to defend any fast food chains and recommend that people eat there because that would make no sense whatsoever. But I do think that we have to be very strategic in the way that we organize protest. And if people don't want to buy a certain product, of course, they always have the right as individuals to decide what they want to do. But if you want to be part of the BDS movement, it's better to act collectively, not individually, and to make sure that it's not just that you decide that a certain company, you don't like them, but you have to have good reasons, and you have to have a clear campaign to say, because of those reasons, we're going to boycott this company, and we expect something from them to respond to our pressure so that we will stop the pressure. It's not just forever. And you did mention also this the questions about anti-Semitism, and as a Jew, I wouldn't be part of a movement if I thought it was anti-Semitic. Of course, I think that the BDS movement makes it very clear that they oppose anti-Semitism, and even if there is some people who express opinions that, let's say, university professors who express Zionist opinions or racist opinions, they are not to be boycotted just because of their opinions. That's not the point. It's all about the institutions. So it's not a movement to boycott Jews. It's a movement to boycott the institutions which are complicit in oppression and discrimination, in genocide. These are, and if we do it collectively, it has a meaning. It has an impact, and so that's also, I think, the issue about the wrong messaging. Because, of course, a lot of people are trying to organize something from grassroots things. Some of them are great. Some of them are not informed enough. So it's good to be connected to the bigger picture. And because it's a global movement with a website, with activists and coordinators all over the world, we're able to help and verify the information so we don't waste our energy in the wrong places. That helps us to be more effective.
All right. So that's a good place maybe to ask you to tell the audience where they should go, both to follow more of you and your work and also to get information about how they can constructively plug into the BDS movement.
The website is www.bdsmovement.net. So should I say it again? www.bdsmovement.net.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And I can check, is that where I can check and confirm? Because let me tell you, I stopped using my face wash. I'm having a breakout. It's like La Roche-Posay. It was on somebody's list. I'm like, I don't know what to, so I should go and confirm and make sure that I'm not having blemishes just for shits and giggles, but that it's actually attached to the actual movement, you're saying.
Yeah. The point is not to work with lists. It's not just that like there's a definitive list of which companies have to be boycotted. The point is that we have campaigns, right? If you just decide not to buy a certain product because you don't like that product, nobody will know that you're doing it for political reasons. If you do it as part of a movement and there's a flyer and there's social media work and so on, then people will know this company has done something wrong and that's why they're being boycotted. And this is an effective way to change things.
I mean, I hear that, but I also have been seeing these articles about McDonald's profits being way down. And maybe that is part of a coordinated effort.
Yeah, McDonald's have absolutely given free meals to soldiers.
Okay.
And they're unable to say, if they would come forward and say, well, we're sorry for this and will not do this again, and we don't want to support a genocide, then, of course, that would change things. But that's not what they do. Instead, they said, we're going to call our branch in Israel like a subsidiary with a slightly different structure of ownership so that we can distance ourselves from this branch of the company. That's almost there. The next step is just to cut that connection, and then the movement will come to an end. Not that I think people should eat there because it's not healthy, but it's there is an effective and coordinated campaign against McDonald's, and you see that it's working.
Yeah, I really appreciate you joining me today. This has been extremely clarifying, and frankly, one of the few more hopeful interviews that I've done on this subject of late. So I really do appreciate you. I also recommend that people check out your interview on the electronic intifada. That was also really great. Thank you for joining me. Thanks to all of the audience for listening and tuning in. You can subscribe to Bad Faith Podcast at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get an extra episode on Mondays every week. Also, if that is not in your budget currently, head on over to Bad Faith YouTube and follow that channel, subscribe to that channel so that you get updates about new content that comes out, but also you get a substantial chunk of the premium episodes get posted over there anyway. Thanks again. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.